Yo, what is up everybody? So if you remember a year ago, I got really into the NFL and we used some data science techniques to try and predict who was going to win and by how many points they were going to win for the last Super Bowl. And guess what? My prediction was exactly correct. We predicted that the Chiefs were going to win by 3 points over the 49ers, and that is exactly what happened. Now, since then, I went back and looked at the last 3 Super Bowls, and interestingly enough, they were all decided by 3-point margins, exactly what the model predicted. So coincidentally or not, kind of cool that the model learned that. But here we are, a year later, and we're going to try to do the same thing. We're going to try and predict who is going to win the 2025 Super Bowl. Now, this time around is a really interesting one for a lot of different reasons. We have the Chiefs coming back, not for their 2nd straight win, but trying for their 3rd straight Super Bowl win. Folks, that has never been done before in the history of the NFL, going back all the way to the 1966 season. It has happened 8 times that the same team has won back-to-back, but we've never had that elusive 3rd victory, and we could see that tomorrow. But not if the Philadelphia Eagles have anything to say about it. They've had a great season so far, and interestingly enough, this is a repeat matchup of what we saw 2 Super Bowls ago, Chiefs versus Eagles, and in that one, Chiefs won by 3 points, and Eagles are trying to reverse that history this time. So this video is going to be an instance of why change what worked last year. We're going to be using the same model as last year. I'll review it really quick for you, but link the more full video from last year in the description below. And just to recap, we're going to be using now up-to-date NFL game data of every single NFL game since the 1966 season when all of this started. It's just going to be information about who the home team was, who the away team was, how many points the home team got, how many points the away team got, and of course, based on all that, who ultimately won the game. Now we're going to be using all of that data to engineer 6 features that are going to be useful, that are going to be helpful for our model to eventually figure out and predict who is going to win and by how much. And those 6 features, again, the same ones we used as last year, are actually just 3 features. It's just that there's one for the home team and one for the away team. So those 3 features really, and again, there's one for home and away, are going to be at any given point during a season, we're going to have the number of games a team has played, we're going to have the number of wins a team has gotten so far, and we're going to have the average point differential of that team's score versus their opponent's score so far. So that's going to be in the season so far, and we're going to use those so far statistics in order to predict what is going to happen in that team's next matchup. So our baseline accuracy is 49.9%, pretty much just a coin flip. So by baseline, we mean what if we just predicted that the home team is going to win every single time, not even take these features into account. If we use the most simple model we can think of to do classification, a logistic regression, we just feed these 6 features and the entire history of the NFL into our logistic regression, we're going to get a pretty big improvement. We're going to get up to 62.5% accuracy on our validation set. And really quick note, as our training set, we're using all the odd numbered seasons, and as our validation set, we're using all the even numbered seasons. Before we go to the actual model we're going to use, which is going to end up having more power than the logistic regression, and we'll get into why, because the logistic regression is so interpretable, we can take a look at what an incremental unit increase in each of our features is going to have on the incremental increase in the probability that a team is going to win a game. And so those incremental increases are shown right here. Most of them make sense. So the more games that you've won so far, the more likely you are to win your next game. Makes total sense because that probably just means you're a better team. The opposite story for your opponent. The more games your opponent has won, the less likely you are to win this game because your opponent is probably better. We see similar directions but smaller magnitudes for the average point differentials. The little bit more confusing one, and by the way, we saw the same exact trend last year, so it's not like it just popped up right now, is that the more games you have played actually somehow decreases your predicted probability of winning your next game. And a couple hypotheses we threw out there were that might be because of something like fatigue. The more games you played, the more injuries your players have. Maybe certain players had to leave altogether, especially those who are doing a lot of work. And so that could be one effect of that. Another one could be something much more simple, such as selection bias. The more games you play, the further into and towards the playoffs and the Super Bowl that you're getting, which means you're playing progressively more difficult teams, which is going to lower your odds of winning that next game just because your opponents are tougher. Now, if you do remember that video from last year, we did not stop at a logistic regression. We actually thought about this and said there's something really sequential to this entire problem. It seems like we're using the team's first game, then they play their next game, then they play their 3rd game. We're using the sequence of games they've played so far in order to predict what's going to happen in the next game coming up. And framed in that way, it seems like this is an ideal candidate to use for a recurrent neural network model, for example, which is exactly trying to use this sequence and the fact that we are dealing with a sequence to predict what's going to happen in the next game. Now, of course, we can use something more complicated in this family of sequential deep learning models like LSTMs or even transformers, but because we're not dealing with a ton of data here, it seems like a recurrent neural network is a good balance between getting that sequential aspect into our model but not overdoing it with too powerful of a model. So last year we found that the ideal number of previous games to feed into our recurrent neural network in order to get the best accuracy on predicting what's going to happen in the next game was 5. So using a team's last 5 games they played to predict what's going to happen in the next game. This year, interestingly enough, we find that the ideal number is 10. So we tried candidates like 3 games back, 5 games back, 10 games back, 15 games back, and 10 kind of seemed like that sweet spot for getting the best accuracy. So we train a recurrent neural network, which uses the last 10 games to predict the next one, and we get almost 2 percentage points more in accuracy over the logistic regression. So just like we saw last year, there is something more to be gained by framing this as a sequential problem. But we don't get as much of a lift from the logistic regression as last year, but hey, a lift is still a lift. Now, the part of the video you actually came for, but don't hate me, before that, I want us to build up a really quick intuition for what you think is going to happen based on just looking at the data. And then of course, we're going to ask this model we trained what it thinks, and that's going to be our eventual prediction. So for us to get a sense of what we think is going to happen based on the very high level data, there's a couple of stats and charts we can look at. So far, the Chiefs have played 19 games and they've won 17 of them. The Eagles have played 20 games and they've won 17 of those. So the Chiefs have a slightly better win rate than the Eagles right now, but those sample sizes aren't too big. And also the Eagles have just played 1 more game overall, so maybe not too much we should read into there. Here's one chart that's kind of interesting. It's looking at the distribution of score differentials for the two teams, meaning how many points did they get relative to how many points did their opponent get during the entire NFL season thus far. You can see that the Eagles are beating their opponents by more. You can see their distribution is shifted more right. But again, there's not a huge sample size behind either of these. It's kind of just 19 or 20 games each. And you can see outliers definitely have an effect. Like you can see that very left game for the Chiefs where they had an absolute loss, getting 0 points versus 38 points that the Broncos got, but that seems more of an outlier than anything. So not a ton of significant data with all these stats, but what does my gut say? I didn't do this last year, but now that I've gotten more into the sport, what does my gut say before we even ask what the model said? My gut, honestly, I think the Eagles are gonna take it. And why does my gut say that? Well, actually, let me point to one more chart that kind of swayed me. This is also looking at the score differentials, but looking at them through the season, sequentially through time. So each bar is how much the Chiefs or Eagles beat or lost to their opponents by. But the very left side of the chart is the very first games in the season. The very right are the most latest games in the season so far. You can see Eagles are just putting up these more dominant figures against their opponents, and it could be an NFC versus AFC thing totally. I know there's a lot of confounders here, but it just seems that if the Eagles can get in the first quarter or second quarter, if they can somehow get that same momentum going that they've been crushing their opponents by in the most recent games, I think they can take it. I think they can take it. That's what my gut says, and I'm expecting at this point to get a lot of spicy comments below. But you're not here for what my gut says, you're here for what the model tells us. So folks, we're going to feed the last 10 games that the Chiefs played and that the Eagles played into our recurrent neural network model, our best performing recurrent neural network model. And drumroll please, we get a 62% win probability for the Chiefs and 38% for the Eagles. Ouch. Now as the last thing we're gonna do, same thing we did last year. This was a classification-based recurrent neural network. We can also train a regression-based recurrent neural network, which uses the same 6 features, but it's not trying to predict probability of winning. It's trying to predict how many points the winning team will win by. And if we pass all of our data into that regression-based recurrent neural network, we get that it's predicting that the Chiefs are going to win by 4.3 points. Let's just call it 4 points against the Eagles. And here I want to be really honest about all the weaknesses of this model, just like I was last year. It's pretty basic, to be quite honest, especially features-wise. We're not taking into account things like player stats, more fine-grained game stats, and even model-wise, we're only looking at the last 10 games in this season. There may be something to be gained, especially given momentum matters. This is the Chiefs' 3rd attempt at a Super Bowl, maybe looking at games from previous seasons and seeing if that can be indicative or predictive of what's going to happen in the next game in the subsequent season or seasons. So I hope you enjoy the game tomorrow. Any comments are welcome in the section below, as spicy or as non-spicy as you want them to be. Like and subscribe for more videos just like this, and I'll see all you wonderful folks next time.